God said that Adam would die on the very day that he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he did not. And in the recent online class that I taught on creation accounts in the Bible, I pointed out that probably the best way to make sense of what is going on here is that God uses a kind of hyperbolic threat, like if you have ever had a parent say to you, if you touch my guitar, I'll kill you. But then you touch the guitar and they don't actually kill you. That's probably what's going on here. There was a use of hyperbole to try to emphasize the seriousness of the consequences.
So I want to address this part of your response first, because it gets to the heart of the issue of the question I was trying to address, which is, did God lie in Genesis 2? The other issues are getting more into the weeds. And I want to say on the outset, what I think you're offering here is a plausible reading. A friend of mine just responded to you and offered another plausible reading based on John Harvey Walton's dissertation. But if the threat of Genesis 2:17 is just hyperbole, then God didn't lie. We make hyperbolic threats all the time, and no one thinks we're lying. Like in your example of the parent threatening the child for touching the guitar. That's not a lie, that's just hyperbole for you're going to be punished. Another helpful example would be if we saw a mother frantically looking for her lost child in a department store, and she said, if I find him, I'm going to kill him. We wouldn't hide the child from her, we'd help her look, because we understand she's being hyperbolic. So if Genesis 2:17 is just hyperbole, then God didn't lie, because the literal meaning of the words would not have been the way the original audience would have understood it. Because they say that he should be sentenced to death.
No, that's not what verse 11 is doing here. In verse 8, the prophets, the priests, and the people all grab Jeremiah and say, you're going to die. And then the city officials show up in the next verse and take their seats. And then the priests and the prophets say to the city officials and to all the people, Mishpat mavet leish hazeh, judgment of death to this man, speaking to the city officials, not to Jeremiah. The notion that that statement is some kind of appositional clarification of the semantic force of the paronomastic infinitive in verse 8 is just pure and utter nonsense.
So I don't really follow your logic here, and I don't think it's being fair to Walton. It sounds like we're just being dismissive. Walton's point is to appeal to the context, which can often show us that a phrase can have a different meaning than its literal meaning. Like in John 11, when Jesus says that Lazarus has fallen asleep and that he must go wake him. He's not changing the literal meaning of the words, he's just using them more in an idiomatic sense. And of course the context explicitly tells us this, playing off the ignorance of the disciples. Walton's point is the context of Jeremiah 26 explains the meaning of the phrase that is being used in verse 8. Regardless of the literal meaning of the words, in that culture they would carry the sense of someone being doomed to die or being sentenced to death.
So this all stems from an Anchor Bible commentary on Genesis. In 1964, Ephraim Spicer published his commentary on Genesis in the Anchor Bible commentary series. And regarding this passage, he said, another infinitive absolute in Hebrew, the phrase need not be translated, you shall surely die, as it invariably is. Death did not result in this instance. The point of the whole narrative is apparently man's ultimate punishment rather than instantaneous death. So this is not an argument based on any grammatical or linguistic or syntactic principles. This is just pointing out, hey, it turned out Adam didn't die, so we should probably reinterpret this. And linguists have repeatedly clarified that this is not an argument about grammar, as Takemitsu Muraoka in his 1985 book Emphatic Words and Structures in Biblical Hebrew stated, Spicer asserts that the force conveyed by the infinitive absolute construction is not necessarily surely, and translates, you shall be doomed to death, but I do not believe that he means that the construction as such indicates fate. Rather, his rendering is theologically orientated, namely that the first human couple did not meet with immediate death after having eaten of the forbidden fruit. So to clarify, no actual linguistic, grammatical, syntactical argument has been made for this reading up to this point. This is just rationalizing a different interpretation because Adam didn't die as expected.
So I don't think it's fair to say they're rationalizing for theological reasons. They're appealing to narrative context in an attempt to understand how the phrase would have been understood in that culture, in places like Jeremiah 26 or Genesis 2. For example, when I read Lord of the Rings and Gandalf is hanging over the bridge of Khazad-dûm, he says, fly, you fools. Now, I don't have to say that Tolkien contradicted himself because the Fellowship didn't sprout wings and fly away. They just left the Mines of Moria on their feet. The context shows us what Tolkien meant by fly, and that doesn't mean the literal meaning of the word fly is changed, but the context forces a different definition onto the word fly in this case. Likewise, it's not necessarily a bad thing to look at the context of Genesis 2 and 3 to understand the verse in Genesis 2:17, or see how it is used elsewhere, like in Jeremiah 26 or 1 Kings 2:37-42. Now, I know you covered the grammar of this passage recently, but the point I would make is based on the narrative. It seems to carry the sense that he will sentence Shimei to death. In 2 Kings 1, the phrase shows up again when King Ahaziah gets sick. For trying to inquire from the god Beelzebub, God says he will surely die. But all that happens is God lets the king die of his disease. So it seems as though God dooms him to die. But all of this is just getting into the weeds. As I said, I think there's many plausible readings, including the one you presented. But in none of these does God actually lie.
And additionally, as I have pointed out in other videos, in other parts of the Bible, God lies. There is a theology of deception in other parts of the Hebrew Bible.
So this opens up a whole new can of worms, but it was never part of my argument as to why I don't see a lie in Genesis 2. In fact, this ties right into my view of normative ethics. For years I've been arguing that the Bible, and specifically the New Testament, teaches something that more aligns with virtue ethics. But within virtue ethics, lying is not always immoral. There are times where lying is the virtuous thing to do. Like, for example, if the authorities from 1930s Germany were to come knocking on your door and ask if you're hiding Jews, and you actually are, the virtuous thing to do would be to lie to them, because you would be protecting innocent lives. And in the Bible, we see that God actually approves of people lying when they're protecting innocent lives. In Exodus 1, God is kind to the midwives for lying to Pharaoh to protect children. Rahab is also commended for protecting the spies from Israel, and she did so by lying at one point. Craig Boyd and Don Thorson borrowed terminology from St. Thomas Aquinas. And note there are 3 different types of lies, but only malicious lying is always morally wrong. Lying to achieve a good moral outcome is often going to be the virtuous thing to do, and this is often what we find in the biblical texts as well. When biblical passages talk about God not being able to lie, the context suggests it's referring to the malicious form of lying. Now, so my audience is aware on virtue ethics, lying is still encouraged to be minimized so it doesn't become habitual. Lying for virtuous reasons needs to be reserved for special cases. It should not be an everyday occurrence. So we don't need to worry if God lied in the Bible for good or moral intent. That would not have been considered sinful in the ancient mindset, but that was never part of the reason as to why I think there's no lie in Genesis 2. And again, it's because there's more logical explanations by appealing to the context and the author's likely intent. And if it's also just hyperbole, that wouldn't be a lie either.